Good morning, and thank you for joining us for a special Facebook Live. I'm historian Edna Friedberg. Our museum remains closed this week, but learning about the history of the Holocaust doesn't have to stop. So we're coming to you live from our homes during this time of coronavirus. I'd like to welcome our guest this week, my colleague, Rebecca Carter-Chand, who is acting director of the program on ethics, religion, and the Holocaust in the Jack, Joseph, and Morton Mandel Center for Advanced Holocaust Study. Welcome, Rebecca.
Thanks, Edna. Good to see you.
And sorry for stumbling on your name.
That's okay.
Good reminder to me to thank our audience in advance for their patience if we experience any technical glitches. My talking is not exactly technical, but it's part of the show here today. In these difficult times, we are committed to connecting you with Holocaust history, and particularly with stories that empower, inspire, and engage. Even in the midst of social distancing and remaining in our homes, this week, millions around the world will celebrate the Christian and Jewish holidays of Easter and Passover this week, and Ramadan later in the month. So during our program today, we will share stories of people who were inspired by their religious faith to act on behalf of European Jews during the Holocaust. We ask you to please post your questions in the comments section here on Facebook, and Rebecca and I will answer as many of them as we can in the course of this program. But let's begin with a little bit of backdrop, Rebecca, because I think when people hear us say that we're going to talk about exceptional individuals, and I want to make sure that we are clear that these people are really extremely rare relative to total populations. People who are motivated by their religious values, that they might be a little surprised if they know anything of the history of Christianity and its attitude towards Jews and treatment of Jews in Europe. As I mentioned, we are in the midst of Holy Week, Semana Santa, which is the week preceding Easter, and the eve today of the Jewish holiday of Passover. And throughout the centuries, this has actually been a time of extreme fear on the part of Jews, where they've been targeted for violence. Can you tell us a little bit about this time of year and its significance?
Sure. You're absolutely right, Edna. Christian teachings that vilified Jews stretch back centuries, including the accusation that Jews killed Jesus and the myth that Jews murdered Christian children in order to use their blood for ritual purposes. And we can trace these threads of anti-Jewish sentiment in both Catholic and Protestant traditions. These ideas sometimes led to violence over the centuries, and this period around Easter and Passover was particularly volatile as Christians recounted the Passion narrative. Now, although many Christian traditions and churches have repudiated anti-Semitism since the Holocaust, it's important to remember as we begin talking about this subject that in the 1930s and 40s, anti-Semitism was deeply entrenched in European society. Now, the Nazis believed that Jews were dangerous biologically, just by being born, and they called for the annihilation of Jews, not just their marginalization. But they were able to draw on this longer legacy of anti-Semitism with its very familiar symbols that had resonance with people, with ordinary people.
So the long history of anti-Semitism in Europe, anti-Judaism in Europe, really provided an opportunity for the Nazis, fertile ground for their accusations against Jews to take root.
Yes. So some practicing Christians during the Holocaust did engage in rescue and resistance or protest, but it was not the norm, certainly. Many people, in fact, supported the Nazis or were at least somewhat sympathetic to their anti-Semitism. So in this environment, in this context, it's all the more remarkable that we do find individuals who went against the grain to actually protect and rescue Jews. And I want to make another point before we delve into our specific stories for today, is that although we will be looking at a number of individuals, it's important to recognize that they're also part of wider networks that came together and people, really risked their own safety and their lives to protect Jews.
So these are people who are not only taking intense life or death practical risks, but also are really kind of being radical in terms of their attitudes, in terms of treating Jewish neighbors or Jewish strangers as just other human beings among them. That was not part of the cultural tradition in most parts of Europe.
Yes.
Viewers, again, please do send us your questions in the comments section. Let us know from where you're watching so that we'll have a sense of who the community is with us today. But Rebecca, let's actually start with an example of an American person, an American rescuer, a woman named Lois Gundin from Goshen, Indiana. Who was she and how did she intersect with the history of the Holocaust thousands of miles from her home?
Yeah, so Lois was just 26 years old. She was living in Goshen, Indiana. She was a French teacher. She was a devoutly religious Mennonite, the Mennonites being one of the historic peace churches that were historically committed to pacifism. As I said, she was 26 years old. She had never been to Europe, never done overseas relief work before, but the Mennonite Central Committee, which is their international relief organization, needed a volunteer who could speak French and was willing to go to Europe and put herself in some danger to help others. So she left the US in October 1941, just 2 months before the United States entered World War II. And she went to France, southern France, to help run the Ville Saint-Christophe, which was a home for children, mostly Spanish children who the home was nearby a refugee camp. So this was a lot of Spanish refugees or people fleeing the Spanish Civil War. And there she provided children with food and clothing and a safe place to become healthy and strong again.
And Rebecca, you had mentioned she was in southern France. For people who may not be as familiar with the history of France during the Second World War, could you just very quickly explain why that is an important distinction?
Right. So when Germany invaded France in 1940, they occupied the northern zone, and the southern and eastern part of France remained unoccupied, but run by authorities that were very much collaborationist with Germany. And then Germany invaded the southern part later on. So when she first went, it was the officially neutral zone of Vichy France. And this particular home that she worked in had anywhere from 20 to 60 refugee children at any one time, ranging from toddlers to teenagers. And as the situation became more dangerous for Jews in France, they began also housing Jewish children alongside the Spanish children in this home. And many of the Jewish children who came to the home had been separated from their parents, who had in fact been deported to Auschwitz. So Lois made a particular effort to sort of hide the children in plain sight or have them blend in and pass as non-Jewish children in order to save and protect them.
And one of the ways that she did that was by hiding their identities from the Christian children among whom they were living. Is that right?
Yes, yeah, and many times the children had already been prepared and instructed by their parents about how to hide their Jewish identity in order to protect themselves.
I remember at one point reading a piece about Lois where it described that she partly became aware that there were Jewish children in the midst because they were reluctant to undress around other kids in the dorm. They didn't want to reveal that they were circumcised because that would have shown that they were Jewish.
Yes, yeah, I mean, it really shows how their parents had a good understanding of what was going on and really prepared the children in a way that is hard to fathom, but in fact did help them.
So in addition to hiding their identities, Lois occasionally actually was even more bold in dealing with authorities who came hunting for Jews within this children's home. Could you tell us a little about that?
Yeah, so it seems that the authorities were aware that some Jewish children were in the home because they came on occasion as they were trying to round up more and more Jews. And so the net was tightening. And at least on a few occasions, because Lois was fluent in French, again, she was able to interact with the authorities in a way and sort of make up excuses as to why the children weren't there at that moment and couldn't be arrested, and really, so she also helped in that way.
And these were typically French police acting on orders coming from the Germans, but they had some autonomy here.
That's right. And here we see some of the children at the home, some of the older ones.
And that's a mixed group of Jewish and non-Jewish children?
I believe so, yes.
Okay.
I mean, often we don't know who exactly was who, because that was the whole point of hiding their identity.
Yeah, exactly. Very, very good point.
Mhm.
I would like to acknowledge some viewers that we have. Thank you for watching from the Holocaust Center of Pittsburgh. We're glad to welcome viewers from Eastern Carolina, from the state of Vermont. People are watching us from Sandstone, Minnesota, from Alabama, and from as far away as Berlin in Germany. So welcome everyone. We're really glad to have you, and I would be glad to answer your questions. So Rebecca, Lois is a young woman in this strange setting, confronting authorities, doing brave things. Was she protected at all because of her American citizenship? Was her status somehow sheltering or shielding her?
Unfortunately, no, quite the opposite. She was arrested as an American citizen after in 1943, in January 1943. So she was arrested. She was essentially a POW, so along with the other Americans. She had been warned by her colleagues that it was getting more dangerous, but she made the choice to stay and take that risk. And then she was arrested and taken to Germany, where she was imprisoned as a POW for over a year. Later, she was released in a prisoner exchange and went back to the United States in 1944, where she continued with her life of teaching until her death, in fact, in 2005. So
even if, as you mentioned earlier, the authorities maybe had suspicions about what was going on in the children's home, the basis on which she was arrested was actually her standing as an enemy alien.
Yes.
A citizen of a country at war with Germany.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So I understand that Lois was quite humble about her efforts, did not talk about it much or at all after she returned to the United States. How did we and the wider world come to learn about the extraordinary life-saving actions she took?
Right. So, like many rescuers during the Holocaust, Lois rarely spoke about her wartime experience afterwards. Her story actually came to light through the research of her niece much later on, who uncovered Lois's letters and diaries from the time. So after her death, Lois was recognized by Yad Vashem as a righteous among the nations, which is the honor that Yad Vashem gives to non-Jewish rescuers. And she's only one of 5 Americans who have received this award of Righteous Among the Nations. I know museum colleagues at the Holocaust Museum have met some members of Lois's family and have learned that Lois would actually be surprised and maybe a little embarrassed about all of this attention that we're giving to her now and her actions during the war.
I know that I grew up in central Illinois, very close to a number of Mennonite and Amish communities. Mm-hmm. In addition to a general anti-violence and humanitarian attitude, modesty and humility are very core values of that community. So it really resonates with me. Mm-hmm. So shout out to anyone who knows Arcola or Tuscola, Illinois. I'd also like to encourage people who are watching, please share today's show with your friends. Share it as an Easter message, a Passover message, or just as a message of hope in troubling times. You mentioned at the outset, Rebecca, the importance of working within networks. Obviously, Lois Gundin was not going off to Europe on her own. She was sent there as an emissary of a formal organization. But let's turn to a European-based, another French-based example of rescue, one of the longest lasting and large-scale rescue efforts in France, the small village of Le Chambon-sur-Lignon. Tell us about the extraordinary things that happened there and what role religious faith played.
Sure, this story is very well known, but it's so special because it involved an extraordinary number of people, quite ordinary people who are willing to risk their safety to shelter approximately 5,000 Jews and others who were fleeing. And so it's really the scale that was so rare. So at the core of this story are the French Huguenot or Calvinist Protestants. who, as a community were an extreme minority, just 2% of the population of France, and had faced hundreds of years of persecution by the majority Catholic country. But they weren't the only ones involved in rescue. And this is sort of what historians have been focusing on more in recent years, is that as a minority, these Protestants had built up a real network in the region, which provided connections and trust. And so they hid Jews in homes, in hotels, farms, and schools. So it really lasted for 4 years, from December 1940 until September 1944, when this one village, only around 5,000 people, I mean, many more in the surrounding village, but in Le Chambon itself, only 5,000 people, and they managed to provide refuge for an additional 5,000 people.
But they didn't only provide hiding places or safe passage, right? Weren't there other resistance activities in which local residents were involved?
Yes, so they did do hiding, but they also helped people cross over the border into Switzerland, and they engaged in other illegal activities, such as producing false identification papers and ration cards and things like that to help people.
So ration cards that gave them access to food.
Yes, absolutely necessary in wartime conditions.
And just to be sure people are clear, the proximity of the village to the Swiss border was important because Swiss was neutral in the war effort and therefore was not a place where Jews would be under German control.
And these Protestants had, long-standing connections with people in Switzerland as well because of their Protestant community.
I'd like to recognize a viewer named Shirley in New York. Shirley has written in to say, thank you so much for revealing the time periods and places where anti-Semitism existed and still exists. And absolutely, Shirley, cannot talk about these stories without understanding the broader context and really just what a brave stand people were taking to stand up for Jews. Along those lines, I'd like to talk about the role of leadership, charismatic leadership coming from the pulpit, and in particular, the leaders of the rescue operations or the rescue network in Le Chambon, a pastor named Andre Trocmé and his wife Magda. They were a major force behind this. Tell us a little bit about the Trocmés, please.
Sure. So Pastor Trocmé's rescue efforts really began with, he was working with Quakers. So again, in connection with a broader community in the region, the Quakers were offering supplies to Jews in internment camps, which were run by the German and French authorities. And so Trocmé learned from these Quakers that they might be able to get some Jews out of the internment camps, but then they would have nowhere to go once they were out. And so Trocmé really mobilized his community to provide opportunities, places for them to go. Many of these Jews were foreign born, and so they were even more vulnerable, I think, and the majority of them were children. I'll just mention, in addition to the Quakers, there were many other groups in the region, American Congregationalists, Red Cross, the YMCA, Salvation Army, other Jewish organizations, and non-believers as well. So it was really a wider effort.
And in a few minutes, we're going to be learning the story about one of the kids pictured in this photo that we just saw,
Yes.
a little boy at the time named Peter Feigl.
Mm-hmm.
Becca, we do have a comment or question from a viewer named Laura. She's asking about the way China is treating Muslim minorities in the western part of China. I assume she means the Uyghur people, and asking whether we can make comparisons. I'm happy to field that question if you'd like.
Sure, I'm sure that you'll talk about the work at our museum of the Simon Scott Center for the Prevention of Genocide, but sure, I'm sure you have an idea of how to answer this.
I mean, in short, I think, and actually it's a perfect time to ask about this because we see that part of what makes the Huguenot population of Le Chambon so empathetic and sensitive to the plight of Jews is that they too have their long history of being a persecuted minority, overwhelmingly Catholic France. And so I think what we see is that religious minority groups are often perceived as a threat or somehow as outsiders who are not worthy of protection by a community, and that those shared histories can can bring us close. In terms of comparisons, I always think it's very important to be specific, or else you just kind of reduce everything to a tale of good and evil. Rebecca just mentioned our colleagues who work in the museum's Simon Scott Center for the Prevention of Genocide, who have for a number of years been shining a light on risks and atrocities being committed against the Uyghur population in China today. So part of why our museum exists is to be a living memorial and to look at this history, not just to make people feel sad and say, oh, what were the failings then, but to see how we can protect other minority groups today when they are targeted on the basis of religion or race or ethnicity. Mm-hmm. I'm going to ask you, though, a little bit more, aside from their history of being part of this minority group, what else motivated the Trocmés, and what do we know this from what they themselves said at the time?
Sure. I mean, André Trocmé, the pastor, was an educated and well-traveled man. He had studied at Union Theological Seminary in New York City in the 1920s, and he had long been a committed pacifist and conscientious objector. And this was an idea that was not very popular even in his own French Protestant denomination, which is one of the reasons why he was sent to Le Chambon several years earlier. It was considered somewhat of a backwater in rural southern France. And so he certainly had these deep beliefs already in him. After the Vichy government was established in 1940 and more anti-Semitic measures were going into place, Trocmé really took on a campaign of peaceful civil disobedience against the authorities. And we can see in his sermons and writings, these consistent themes of loving the enemy, hospitality to strangers, individual conscience, and the idea of the Jews being God's chosen people. And he also preached directly against anti-Semitism and spoke out again, which is very, very rare for a clergy person in this period. He gave a public sermon protesting the mass roundup of Jews in Paris in July 1942. And I will quote one sentence of what he said: "The Christian church must kneel down and ask God to forgive its present failings and cowardice." A strong statement from a pastor. And as I said, not everyone shared his particular religious beliefs or were part of his church, but I think that his leadership did really shape his community's response.
Yeah, he was an outspoken man of true principle, as was his wife and other members of his family. I'd like to welcome viewers watching us from all around the world, from Egypt, from Belgium, from Brazil. Really glad to have you with us. And again, please do share this program with your friends. Now or later, it will be available to watch later from our Facebook page. So, Pastor Trocmé, as you've described, made no efforts to keep a low profile or to hide his opposition to the occupying powers or to the collaborationist French authorities. What were the risks for him and for the wider community networks engaged in these rescue efforts? What was at stake?
Well, sheltering Jews became increasingly dangerous as time went on. And in February 1943, the French police actually arrested Trocmé and another pastor, along with the headmaster of a local school. And they were interned for 28 days and then released. And then they went back and continued their activities until late 1943, when there were rumors that they would again possibly be arrested, and they went into hiding themselves. And at that point, Trocmé's wife, Magda Trocmé, took over the rescue operation. So they in fact continued it. In June 1943, the German police raided a local secondary school and arrested 18 students, and among them were some Jews. And they were in fact deported to the east, to Auschwitz, and were later killed. Along with these students, the police arrested Daniel Trocmé, who was André Trocmé's nephew, and he was deported. Here we see a picture of him. He was deported to Lublin and Majdanek concentration camp, where he was murdered. And it was just 2 weeks later that the region, in fact, was liberated by the Free French Armored Division.
So it's he really almost made it to a time of safety.
Mhm.
I was really quite moved. I did a little bit of reading about Daniel Trocmé in
Mhm.
preparation for this show. He was a science teacher and he was working as the principal of one of the boarding schools in town where Jewish children were hidden, Jewish students were hidden. I just want to read a quote from a survivor, a man who lived to become a man because of the shelter of Daniel Trocmé. He said, Daniel Trocmé never thought of himself. He was deeply conscientious. At night, you might find the school director working by a dim nightlight, repairing children's shoes with bits of rubber tire. And in fact, he was, I believe, out of the area at the time of the German raid and came back. He could have stayed hidden, but he came to be with his children. So a true martyr and a beacon of courage and compassion. Rebecca, you've told us about Le Chambon from the rescuer's perspective, but we had seen a photograph earlier of a group of children who were hidden there. Let's talk about one of them in particular. A boy at the time 13 years old, now grown up to be a man, named Peter Feigl, who we've had the privilege to know because he is a Holocaust survivor volunteer at
Mhm.
our museum here in Washington. Tell us about Peter Feigl and how Le Chambon saved his life.
Yes, I mean, it's a remarkable story. Peter was just a child, as you said, 13. His family had fled to France after the Germans had invaded his native Belgium in 1940. They were in France, and his parents sent him to a summer camp run by the Quakers in this region in southern France, which is very common at the time. They were hoping to protect him, and when the Vichy government began rounding up Jews and deporting them to concentration camps in German-occupied Poland. Um, and so, we see that Peter's parents, instincts, although very hard decisions, they were right to send him to the camp because they themselves were deported and killed at Auschwitz. Um, when an effort to send Peter to the United States stalled in mid-January 1943. I mean, we know this became very difficult to get to the United States at that point. He was just put on a train with directions for where to change stations. He arrived at 1 a.m. And was met by Daniel Trocmé, this teacher that you just spoke about. They hiked for 2 hours before coming to Daniel's home. And Peter remembered the generosity of the people of Le Chambon. More broadly, he said of them, these good people did actually put into action what the good book told them to do. They didn't just talk about it, which I think is a very powerful statement. So Peter was sent to another hiding place in France during the war, and then eventually was able to immigrate to the United States in 1946 with the help of relatives.
We have a question from Ariana in Toronto. She's asking that she had heard about a diary that Peter had kept. And if it's all right with you, I love this story so much, Rebecca, I'd like to tell it. You're absolutely right, Ariana, and actually look in our comments later. We will post a link to a short video where Peter talks about his diary.
Mhm.
But the short story is this. As Rebecca had described, Peter's parents sent off their 13-year-old son to a Quaker summer camp, hoping to keep him safe. He had no idea where his parents were, if he would ever see them again, no way to communicate with them. And so he began to keep a diary written as though he were talking to his parents. This is a scared, lonely boy talking about his experience. And after he arrived in Le Chambon, Daniel Trocmé, the brave teacher we've talked about several times, noticed little Pierre, as he was known, writing in his diary, asked him what he's writing, looked at it, and got scared because the details in it, if they were seen, would have revealed and compromised many, many people's lives. So Daniel Trocmé took the diary from Peter in order to protect and shield him. As we've heard, Daniel Trocmé was deported and died. And as far as Peter knew, his diary disappeared. In the late 1980s, a documentary movie called Weapons of the Spirit was made about the rescue effort in Le Chambon. Peter Feigl makes a brief appearance in it as an interview, a talking head, talking about being a kid there. And a man in Paris saw Peter Feigl and said, hey, this rings a bell. A few years after the war, this man in Paris had bought little Peter's diary at a flea market in France. He saw this movie, he made the connection, he tracked down Peter, and he returned the diary to this boy, now grown into a man living in the United States. And we are very, very honored and touched that Peter has chosen to donate his museum, his diary, to the Holocaust Museum in Washington. It is a treasured item in our collection, and we are very, very honored to be the stewards and caretakers of it. So kind of truth is stranger than fiction, crazy story.
It is crazy. I mean, both of the stories we've told today have to do with diaries, and we learn all of these, the details that really put the human face on their stories through the diaries. So.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Before we close, I'd like to do shout outs to a couple of other viewers and watching from Sydney, Australia. I wasn't thinking about the time zone there, but someone is saying this is a poignant ending to our Seder night. So people who are observing Passover with the ceremonial Seder watching this. So thank you and Chag Sameach to you. Another viewer, Cheryl, says that in the current context of coronavirus, she's thinking about the level of care and compassion that it would have taken to sustain for neighbors for 4 years, that it's both deeply admirable and humbling. Any final thoughts on that, Rebecca?
Oh, I think that's just spot on. Absolutely. Yes. We often think about the great big, the huge risks of being arrested, but of course it took just everyday sacrifice as well to feed and shelter people. So I think that's a very good reminder.
Well, thank you very much, Rebecca, for being with us today. In closing, I'd like to quote from words of Pastor Andre Trocmé, who said at the time, "These people came for help and for shelter. I am their shepherd. A shepherd does not forsake his flock. I do not know what a Jew is. I know only human beings." Mm-hmm. Today we got insight into their humanity, into their bravery, and into their religiously inspired ideals. Tonight, as we've mentioned several times, marks the start of Passover, which is the Jewish holiday of liberation. And we pay tribute to Lois Gundin and to the Trocmés, Andre, Magda, and Daniel, and all of the residents of Le Chambon and the surrounding area for their courage and compassion in protecting Jews who were in peril in modern times. Thank you for watching us on Facebook. We want you to stay tuned for our next live conversation, which next week will take place instead on Tuesday, April 14th at 9:30 a.m. We are moving the program so that our followers who are observing Passover will be able to join us for the conversation. And we wish all of you who celebrate religious holidays this week, happy Easter and a meaningful period of reflection, whatever your background or community. Take care.